What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the podcast for the very first time, Nicholas Spencer. That's right, he is a senior fellow at the Theos. It's a think tank, and he's going to do some thinking. He's been writing for a bit, looking at the relationship of science and religion. His book, Magisteria, looks at the history of it and how our understanding of that history has kind of problematized the ability to engage both across those disciplines of science and religion. He has a brand new book that's about to come out in the United States that is based on a lot of survey data and interaction with scholars in different disciplines about how they understand science and religion and the potential for dialogue and what are the limits and such to those dialogues. And we're going to actually get to talk about that in this episode. But for those that don't know, I mean, you're listening to a podcast. Nick is also the host of the Reading Our Times podcast, which is a stellar podcast. Each season, there's usually a particular theme, and then throughout the season, the interviews are all with authors that have written rather important books wrestling with that theme. Like this season that's currently started just a few weeks ago is looking at the crisis of kind of Western democracies and where that's going culturally. And other seasons looked at the changing nature of, say, religion in the West. Anyway, it's great. Always an excellent job. So I hope you enjoy this conversation, because I know I did, and I'll put links to everything on the blog post in the podcast description area. And yeah, here we go. Enjoy. Nicholas Spencer. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Nicholas Spencer on the podcast for the first time, and it's always exciting to get to talk to someone with a cool accent who you read them and you can't really produce the accent. So I've enjoyed your books, and now we're getting to talk, and looking forward to it.
Well, that's very kind, and I have to say that it's the first time ever I've appeared anywhere where someone's accused me of having a cool accent, so I will bank that.
Oh, no. Anytime you get, as a Southerner who spent a lot of time undoing their Southern accent in graduate school to be taken seriously, I had the experience of just looking at anyone had a British or Scottish or Australian accent, people react to them like their IQ's 20 points higher just because, but you lose 20 for being Southern. If I turned it back on like this, they're like, or you pronounce Heidegger, they don't take you seriously anymore. One of the interesting things about your own work is that you are both invested in this larger conversation of science and religion, looking at its history, and that your position as a senior fellow at Theos is also looking at the kind of the cultural side of it and what's going on across education and disciplines, which is a unique blend, especially in science and religion. It's hard enough to get someone who's a proficient in more than one discipline. I'm interested in how you see all those intersections as a vocation, as a scholar, as a person of faith, of tending to all these different audiences in a space that so few people try to do each of them.
Yeah, so in a strange way, science and religion is, in theory, or was, off-piste for me. It's just become pieced over the last 10 years or so. I mean, my original academic background, my first degree was in literature and history a very long time ago, but I've always had a live interest in the history of ideas. And back in 2009, we did a big project at Theos, coinciding with the big Darwin anniversary of that year, 150 years since the publication of The Origin and 200 years since his birth. And it also was a couple of years into the whole new atheist movement. Darwin was the poster boy for atheism. Evolution was the gotcha, was the argument against theistic belief. I wasn't persuaded by either of those points. And I did quite a bit of work on science and religion, or specifically evolution and Christianity at that time. My main interest, though, has been, I suppose you would call it, public theology, and more specifically political theology. My doctorate, which was actually only completed about 5 years ago, I did it in part-time in my middle age, was on political theology. So I guess I've always come to science and religion with the awareness that they are both human practices embedded in certain social, cultural, political, and economic norms, and that all human ideas are ideas that are had by humans who live in certain times and in certain places. And so, even though when they're talking about evolution, for the sake of argument, they're talking about evolution, they're also talking about the way in which the ideas that cluster around the theory of evolution, what implications they have for the society in which they live, what implications they have for how we run the economy, for how, in that particular example, how we treat the weak, for example. And so, in that regard, even though my political theology and my interest in science and religion are superficially quite separate, actually they overlap in what I think is a reasonably fruitful way.
Yeah, yeah. In one of the things that's real interesting to me, just looking at your last three works, or the one that's about to come out in America, is in Magisteria, looking at the history of science and religion, and kind of problematizing that dominant narrative that so shapes the populace, right? Even people within the guild of science or in religion, the conflict narrative has had this role, and then looking at the places in our culture now where the entanglement of science and religion generates questions of intense meaning and purpose and what it means to be human, and questions like AI, extraterrestrial. It was like, if you were a blogger, then you went through like, what are the 20 most hyped topics for science and religion in the public square, and I'm going to take them and then show you that this might be a good place to do science and religion better in playing God, which I just think is such a fun, another fun way of like helping us see our history better, than see that we're asking these questions of scientific and religious significance. And then in your upcoming book, doing both long-term research, both the quantitative and the qualitative elements of people practicing the sciences and what the populace thinks about science and religion. You have like these three different angles that give you a rather thick account. And so, before jumping into either one of them, I'm interested if there were bits in either the history or the popular discourse or examining culture, that after the research you go, I didn't anticipate this finding or this causal factor playing such a big role in these different areas.
Yeah, so that was undoubtedly the case with Magisteria. The origins of Magisteria was in a BBC Radio 4 series that I did back in 2018, I think it was. I mean, the origins of that were that, look, anybody who has worked in the academy or just been aware of the academy of this area in the last 40, 50 years or so will be conscious of the way in which the warfare metaphor has been systematically deconstructed by a series of really very good and extremely accessible scholars. That, as you intimate, has not passed down to a popular level where the default position is these two are at odds. So actually, Magisteria intended in the first instance simply to be a bridge between lots of good work that's been done in the academy and a wider popular audience. And it was intended in that regard to dismantle a narrative that the wider popular audience believed in, that of conflict. That in itself is, as it were, for a publisher enough. You're saying something new and fresh, even though from your point of view, it's not particularly new and fresh because scholars have been saying it for 40 years or so. But what emerged when writing the book was, because I didn't want to replace one single simplistic narrative of conflict with another single simplistic narrative of harmony, because it most certainly hasn't been harmonious for 1,500 years or however long. There emerged, I was on the lookout for what might be a controlling theme here, what might be an underlying idea that made sense of the relationship of these two shifting protean entities over the centuries. And the more I read and researched, the more it struck me that the controlling idea was the concept of the human, and equally importantly, who gets to adjudicate authoritatively on that concept. And so often in the points of tension there are between science and religion, and I'll put those both in inverted commas because they're historically shifting categories throughout history, when the two have come into tension and conflict, actually underlying cause of the tension has been a disagreement about how we understand the human, and more specifically, when one discipline or other, usually the latest scientific kid on the block, makes a land grab and says, this idea now fully explains what it means to be human, and in the process makes an exclusive and exhaustive claims that denies the validity of any other claim. And that is the moment, for reasons we might come on to, that is the moment when science and religion has got tense. That argument was then carried over into playing God, because science in the 21st century has a greater capacity to understand, manipulate, control, and quote unquote improve the human. And that being so, science is going to find itself on a territory that historically has been contentious, and also, philosophically speaking, is at very least amenable and open to a theological perspective.
When you look at the way the history's played out and been received, and these, and really kind of like the speeding up of conversations in the public square that kind of beg us to have a more sophisticated account. Like, what were your assumptions going into the big research part for the landscapes of science and religion that you wanted to test? And because I found what academics think is normative about science and religion among their peers is not actually the case if you happen to be that one person on faculty that they think understands science and religion enough, but is also comfortable talking to you about your spiritual experiences and things. I found that there was an like a operating boundary marker on how these disciplines relate that just didn't exist after a gin in not with a tie on kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the reasons I put science and religion in inverted commas earlier on is that these are questionable categories, or at least they're contestable categories. The Landscapes book was influenced very heavily by Peter Harrison's book, The Territories of Science and Religion, which is an attempt to show how those concepts of science and religion that the popular narrative imagines have been in conflict forever couldn't have been in conflict forever because they didn't exist forever. They're actually relatively modern concepts. The kind of things that we do within the category of science and within the category of religion, we have done in some form or other for centuries, arguably for millennia. But they weren't understood, conceptualized, and tightly categorized as science and religion in the way that they allegedly, I'll come back to that, are today. Peter's book tries to show that they are shifting protean categories. It ends at the end of the 19th century when the two concepts have arguably settled down into recognizably modern forms. But, and this is where we move on to where we are today, in actual fact, even if we have a relatively good idea of what science is and what religion is, as soon as you start looking in any detail of what these things actually are, the boundaries start to dissolve again. And this is particularly important if you're talking about the relationship between science and religion, because unless you pay some attention to what you actually mean by science and what you mean by religion, it is more or less meaningless to say that I think science and religion are compatible or incompatible, because people like Ken Ham from the Creationist Institute and Richard Dawkins fundamentally totally agree. They absolutely agree that evolution and Christianity are incompatible, but they have such different ideas of what those notions are, or certainly their truth content in that particular example, that unless you explore what they are actually talking about, the nature of the relationship they purport to have between them is irrelevant. That then sends you down a rabbit hole, because how do you define science and religion? I don't know how philosophical you want to get in this discussion, but Landscapes borrows a lot from Wittgenstein, and borrows in particular two critical ideas: the idea of language, meaning comes through usage, effectively. You've got to observe and interrogate the forms of life that give the context to the speech that people use to understand the meaning of those terms. So you've basically got to talk to and listen to people, how they're using those terms. That's the first idea. And the second one is the idea of family resemblances, which puts forward the idea that when you're thinking about categories like this, you cannot definitively say that something is a X and draw very clear boundaries around it. Wittgenstein used the example of a game in the philosophical investigations, and without going into too much of the detail, we appropriate that principle talking about science. In other words, there are some things you can call science very confidently because they exhibit lots of the different sub-factors, if you like, that you see about science. Physics is the obvious example. There are some things that are questionably science, though. They exhibit some of them, archaeology or anthropology. What about economics? What about sports science? So the boundaries get blurred, and then you start to understand that both science and religion are these complex, multivariate, sort of blurred entities that do come into contact in lots of different ways, and therefore the relationship between them cannot be neatly conceptualized as one of straightforward opposition or harmony.
Yeah, I really appreciated the use of Wittgenstein there, and the kind of taking Peter Harrison's work on territories and then shifting the metaphor towards landscapes when asking the research question that's at the heart of what you were doing. I wonder if you might would you draw that out a bit and go okay, if we're thinking about landscapes, if we're wanting to look at how language is used in the modern context within the academy, within the larger citizenry, when you're doing your survey work, what what kind of guides looking at our current landscape around science and religion to then do the kind of large form interview process and the survey data? Like how did you see the kind of the question of this landscape of science and religion needing these tools to answer
Yeah.
it?
So landscapes, the metaphor, is an example of what you alluded to earlier, which was an idea that kind of came along rather than was there at the inception. The landscape metaphor is essentially, it's obviously drawing on Peter's work, but it's, I think, useful because a landscape is, as it were, a territory seen from ground level. And territories implies maps and borders, but if you get to the level of a landscape, you don't see those. You just see the features on the landscape. And the word features features quite a lot in the book, partly because Wittgenstein uses it as well, but partly because that's how you recognize a certain landscape. So what we wanted to do was understand what these entities, the vaguest word I can use, looked like from the level of people who spoke about them. And that then gave us an opportunity to look at two particular areas of discourse. One is, for want of a better word, professional discourse. So we interviewed over 100 often quite prominent leading scientists, philosophers of science, sociologists of science, theologians, religious studies experts, and sort of professional communicators in both. And for each of those, we spoke to them for an hour plus and in detail talked about what they did, how they understood what they did, and so on and so forth. And then there was a large quantitative study that we commissioned from a British polling company. This is all UK based, I should say, which is a very important point, which we might come back to. You can't ask the general public the same kind of questions you ask a philosopher of science for all the obvious reasons. But we were trying to get through the general polling data an idea of what people understood science to be, what people understood religion to be, and in the light of that, how they understood them relating to one another.
You mentioned that this series of extensive interviews, and I wonder if there was a significant or maybe unexpected insight that you gained hearing perspectives from such a diverse group of academic people, vocationally academic.
So I think that the thing that most surprised me was the relative lack of hostility there was in that group. I should precede that by saying that the subtitle of the book, and in a sense the purpose of the entire project, was to understand what people are disagreeing about when they're disagreeing about science and religion. As a result of that, we deliberately slanted our survey so that we had a large proportion of people who were non-religious, who were atheistic, to a different, no kind of religious background. Because we spoke to a number of people who were believers and theologians, so on and so forth. But if you're there to try and find out what people are disagreeing about when they're disagreeing about science and religion, and your interviewee fundamentally isn't disagreeing about anything, they don't think there is any tension, it tends to be either a short or quite a hard interview. Whereas if people think, yes, there genuinely are tensions here, it gives them something to go on. But time and time again, in the first place, so many of our interviewees deliberately distance themselves from what they might call the Dawkins position. I'm an atheist, but not like that. And secondly, even though they were non-believers themselves and saw there were points of tension, there wasn't anything like the kind of animated tension that has existed, particularly in the popular mind since the new atheist days. So it was almost as if the more people knew about this subject, the more they realised that there were nuances and subtleties and caveats at play here, and the less space there was for a clear, definitive, oppositional position.
Sometime relatively recently, there was that study where it organized academic respondents by disciplines, where the harder the science, the more likely they are to believe in some form of ultimate mind-like reality. So to the point that if you ask the general populace in that study, the general populace is like, oh, well, they're professors, so they probably don't believe this, this, and this. And what they're really describing is what social scientists they're accurate for social scientists, the least hard of the sciences, but physicists were, significantly more likely to affirm something like that. And when I read that study, it was one of the only times I've seen it divided up like that. So I wonder if those similar dynamics showed up in longer form interviews, where if what you're dealing with are harder sciences or those that we have kind of where the cosmological constants feature more, or this kind of thing, or were fields not invented by 19th century, critics of religion. Did that kind of previous data show up in any particular way or get nuanced in the interview process?
Great question. So my short answer is impressionistically yes, but 100 interviews, there's no statistical significance there. We might well have chosen a different physicist who gave us a completely different view when you're dealing with a sample size that's small. Intuitively, that makes sense. I mean, it does amuse me looking back at the history of science and religion that for some reason it's lodged in the public's mind that physics, Big Bang, cosmology, that's where the kind of the tension exists. And it really, really isn't. And historically, it really isn't. If you want to go to the disciplines, the scientific disciplines that are most antagonistic towards religious belief historically, go to the social sciences. I mean, that was almost like a sibling rivalry in the 19th century, and like Cain and Abel wise, one of those siblings is determined to kind of kill the other one. That's a kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek thing to say. It is impressionistically the case that if we spoke to mathematicians, in particular, because maths, is it a science? Well, we included it. I'm exaggerating slightly here, but doing maths without having at least some kind of Platonic conception of reality gets a bit hard sometimes, because you're clearly talking about stuff that can't touch, can't see, can't taste, but is there and was there before us and is going to be there after us. Physics, slightly less so. I think the messier things get, the more antipathy, the more resistance there is. And, in particular, if, the religion's Achilles heel, so to speak, is suffering, it's quite a big Achilles heel, really, more of an Achilles body, that one, then if you've immersed yourself in evolution by natural selection, you're going to be pretty well attuned to the prevalence of pain and suffering within creation. So I think that makes sense. But there's one important kind of footnote to add to this entire conversation, is that a lot of it depends on whether you're thinking about the God of the Abrahamics, for example, or the God of the philosophers. And the latter is relatively easy, very easy to give credence to if you're a mathematician or a kind of a cosmologist, but that doesn't translate anything close to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, and that what's fascinating to me is the moment you get to a space where the plausibility of an ultimate mind-like reality is rather significant, and you can detach that conversation from the rather specific claims of any of the monotheistic traditions. That dynamic of the difference is something that's been at play throughout church history altogether, right? So, like, if you even go back into the earliest time, those were the different trajectories of the apologists. Some like, say, like, someone like Justin Martyr is framing things in that, like, yes, our encounter and discovery and relationship with wisdom and blah 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 blah, and then how do you introduce Jesus as an expression, a particular universal expression of this, and that's different than the more combative tone of Tertullian, where oh, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? And that dynamic has just kind of always been at play. And I wonder, thinking of the kinds of questions that show up in Playing God and that thread you mentioned running throughout all of this different research, that underneath the history and present debate of science and religion is the question of what it means to be human and what is the authority to ask it. I imagine, like, when the questions are anthropological, when it's about both the external world and how we evaluate and understand our internal world, that the particular claims of any tradition that come upon you, be it the identification of Jesus as the Christ, or the enemy as the object of your love, or any of these kinds of things that make demand on you, that creates a different authority structure for making where that claim on the self is at play than the kind of generous response to awe, wonder, structure, and interpretability of the cosmos. And so that, like, when those kinds of distinctions about what it means to be human, how do those get expressed, or have you seen them expressed in the broad populace, right? Showing up in the kinds of questions you looked at in Playing God, and then in the larger kind of data when you did the quantitative survey across the UK, where if you look at just the conversations we're having and the answers that we're giving broadly as a people, how does that humanity question show up and get framed?
So, just to take one step back from that, one of the things that emerged very clearly in the research that we were doing for the background of the landscapes was the way in which, as I said earlier, you can't ask the general population the same kind of questions you ask a philosopher of science. The general population certainly has more or less formed views of what science is and what religion is, but for the vast majority of them, they become embedded in the existing morally laden narratives. So Joe on the Clapham omnibus might not have the faintest idea about what the scientific method is, but he hears, listening to the news on the way home, that scientists have discovered X, or scientists have developed Y. So science is embedded in a progressive and morally laden and usually morally positive narrative, and religion very much less so. It is embedded in a narrative, and it's embedded in a morally laden narrative, but it is very often not so morally positive, although it can be socially positive. The point about that is that people are engaging with these concepts of the human, but they're engaging in them already through these morally laden narratives. So it's not that they have a particular idea of the way in which science or indeed religion might frame these fundamental anthropological questions in anything like an abstract way, but they will be aware of, take one of the examples from Playing God, the capacity, or at least the interest in scientists to genetically modify humans so that they may be more resistant to certain harms. They might have heard the story of He Jiankui, the Chinese biophysicist who went public in 2018, I think it was, might have been a bit later, initially insanely on YouTube, saying that he had cloned two twin girls in such a way as they would be resistant to HIV/AIDS. So they are aware of this narrative, and that then brings with it the question of, well, hang on a second, should we do that to a human being? What's the right way to treat a human being? In another very, very exhaustingly popular narrative at the moment, at what point will AI become conscious, or will it become conscious, and should robots have rights, and so on and so forth? So these fundamentally anthropological questions come in on the narrative, on the coattails of these morally laden narratives, and that's the point when they start thinking about, what does it mean to be a human, and does a human have a soul? That word keeps on getting used. I mean, I wouldn't have the foggiest idea about Aristotelian versus Platonic notions of the soul, but I have a notion of what it is to be intrinsically human. So, instead, people are having these conversations, they're thinking about these conversations, even if they're not conscious of doing so in anything like an abstract or theorized way.
Yeah, and one of the things that it shows up, at least, when you get in an Uber and you're trying to decide the answer as to what do you do, or you're sitting on a plane, right? And you're like, do I want to say, oh, I teach science and religion, or do you want to say, I do things on the internet about God, like or if you want them to not talk to you on an airplane, you say, I'm a Baptist evangelist. That's what that's like, since I am an ordained Baptist clergy, they'll just stop real quick, But I found in ways that doesn't happen in the U.S. Of if I was in Scotland and I'm getting a cab and they're taking me to my house. Oh, you work at the uni? Yeah. What do you do? And I'm like, science and religion. Almost the immediate response is like, well, how does that work out? Do you worry about getting paid each week? Do people get in fights in your class? You just go through where the response is something, intense. Or then they ask questions and they're just kind of shocked. They're like, so you like science and God, and you're like, yeah, and that you can just do that, and it's funny because they're, unlike in the U.S. where the anti-intellectualism streak is so big. They're like, oh, you do this at New College right next to the castle in Edinburgh, so this must be legitimate. They're like, that's fascinating. The number of people are like, well, is there something I could read on this? It was, as opposed to, in America, the likelihood, if it's a religious person, you say this, they're like, really? So you believe in evolution? And you're like, well, I don't know if you believe in it, but is it uh, a rather compelling interpretation of the best evidence we have at the moment that might lead one to think about a different way? The creative expression of the divine invitation to possibilities has come through. You're like, how do I say this in a way that, doesn't off-put them? And they're like, nah, look, I believe in the Bible. I'm not an animal, right? And I'm like, well, when you mentioned earlier about the even looking at the UK specifically in the survey data, I wonder what stuck out to you in looking at the UK and its context, and then if you're talking with other scholars who've done similar things in other places around the globe, are there parts of the US or parts of Australia or stuff where you go, oh, there's a lot of resonance in when we were comparing data, and oh, well, that's an aberration compared to what I discovered.
Yeah, that's again, great question. US has huge amounts of research on this, and it's vastly ahead of anywhere, including the UK. I think there is some research in continental Europe. I'm not familiar with much of it. Ditto Australia. So the obvious comparison to be made between the UK and the US, and you've effectively underlined it there. But it goes back to an early part of our conversation about how these are not abstract, theorized conversations. When you are talking to someone in the US about evolution, you're not talking about evolution, or rather, evolution is the doorway into a much, much larger mansion where there are lots of other things going on there. I'm coming over to the US in a few months' time to give a talk as part of the Scopes at 100. I don't know what you call. Would you call them celebrations? I don't know, commemorations. Anniversary. Let's say anniversary.
Yeah. I don't know what about it is thoroughly worth celebrating.
Exactly.
Unless you emphasize that the textbook they're arguing over had eugenics.
Well,
in it. And it's good to get rid of eugenics.
So when I wrote the chapter in Magisteria on Scopes, I read some of Hunter's civic biology, I think, isn't it? Well, here's the thing. It would never get published today, never get published. And your East Coast liberals would go absolutely mental about it because it effectively says, well, you know what it says, it effectively advocates eugenics in one chapter. And P.S., which I didn't know before researching the book, at that time in Tennessee, parents were required to pay for the textbooks that their children studied at school. So I am required by law to pay for a textbook that my children are going to read that says that people like me basically shouldn't exist in society. I can understand why people got a bit hot under the collar about that. Frankly, I'm a fully paid up evolutionist, but I'd think twice about which side I was on. That last comment is tongue in cheek, but it's an example of how when these things become socially and culturally and economically laden in that way, you're not talking about the science, at least not for very long. You're talking about what you think the science implies. Your friend talking about, I'm not an animal. Well, you've got a digestive tract, you kind of are. But he's not saying that, is he? He's saying, I don't want to be treated in such a way as undermines my dignity. It tells me that I don't have an eternal soul, brackets, whatever that is, that undermines the fact that I have free will and agency and moral reflection and so on and so forth. That has been put on steroids in the US for lots and lots of historical reasons that we won't talk about now. It is far less absent in the UK, far less absent in the UK. And yet, apropos your taxi drivers in Edinburgh, it's still there. Your taxi drivers in Edinburgh won't have been required to pay for a textbook to their kids to read, to tell them that taxi drivers in Edinburgh are not really a worthwhile form of human life. And yet, there is still this default instinctive reaction about, the two, how do you do that? How do you do? I got to be honest with you, I do find that kind of mystifying. There was a time, don't get me wrong, in the post-Darwinian period where, well, I'll put it this way. At one point, Darwin writes a letter towards the end of his life in which he says to one of his friends, I can't remember who it was, that you would be quite amused to read the letter I recently received from a clergyman that I can't even quote it, I can't exactly, but was ripe in its abuse towards me, and I've received loads of these, and I've been to the Darwin archives, and they're there. That was a thing. Like I said, let's not airbrush history here, but it was a thing in the 1860s and the 1870s, and the idea that there have been major events in British history relating to science and religion that should perpetuate this science and religion antipathy, which the model of which was drawn from two books that were published in the US in the late 19th century. It seems to me very strange. Now, as it happens, I think there's a reason for it. Science, we talk about this in various books, science, modernity, progress, secularism, they come in a tied up package. And the fear is you start picking at one and the whole package falls apart. And that's the concern, really, that that's why the rhetoric goes so off the dial sometimes. Because if you start saying that religion is compatible with science, you start to undermine this package of modernity and progress that has helped us build the wonderful world we live in today.
When you're looking at that question of personhood across your work, the question of Darwin, the origin of the species and such, problematizes that notion of personhood because of our inheritance. Like, what's the history we're in? What is our inheritance biologically and culturally? Problematizes, right, the finality of biblical narratives, of human origin, and that kind of thing. In Playing God, we're increasingly having cultural questions about what it means to be human, not about just our past, but our future. What's on the horizon? AI, genetic editing, all these kind life expansion and such. I know we're tempted to think, the questions of the horizon and the future and what it means to be human are uniquely intense in the present. I wonder if you see other moments in the history of humanity where the question of being human was similarly flooded by questions of inheritance and challenges put on the horizon, or are there parts of it that you think this is a unique predicament of our modern moment?
Well, I mean, I would say that and as a historian, I would certainly say this, that all questions about the past are also questions about the future. You don't need to read your Orwell to know that he who controls the past controls the present, he who controls the present controls the future. And so, yes, undoubtedly, there are in the early 19th century specific questions about the historicity of Genesis and the origins and dignity of human beings. But if you read any of these debates in the 19th century, you don't have to read very far to see them pivot towards, and what does this mean for the future? I think, that in these debates, the future and past and future are always very closely linked. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that to have a discussion about the past, you have to have so that doesn't necessarily mean to say that to have a discussion about the future, you necessarily have to have a discussion about the past. And I think that is what is particularly interesting today, that Plain God looks at 8 different technologies, which are very kind of current ones, and they're not all about kind of the future in the sense of developing and changing the human, but a lot of them are. And this is a remarkably live issue at the moment. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that in one sense, it's never not been a live issue, because all scientific questions and developments many scientific developments are tied to technological developments. And when you have technological developments, you inevitably have, or at least should have, ethical questions. Ethical questions are asked, always have been, about how you use new technology. I mean, they're often asked too late, but they're asked. But it seems to me that the questions we're asking now are less about the ethics of extreme life extension or genetic modification or recognition of AI or the animal personhood movement. There are ethical questions, but don't get me wrong, but they're so embedded in who we are as a person, they're fundamentally anthropological questions. And the question of what we should do has now really fully given way to the question of who even are we? What kind of creature should we be? That's a very forward-looking question, and you don't have to have a particularly well-formed view of where we have come from in order to answer it. You just need to have some formed idea of what kind of creature are we.
One of the things that is particularly difficult when asking these larger questions around both our own identity as an individual and as a species, be it life extension or AI, genetic engineering, vaccines, abortion, these kinds of things, is there is such a radical pluralism when it goes to our ethical frameworks in our culture, and this kind of the ethics of authenticity and the freedom of the individual being prized in a way. The authority space for answering who am I and who are we, it seems that we've cut ourselves off from having a shared narrative. And when we can't have a shared narrative, I think there's these temptations, right, to be like, the archetype new atheist and sees the scientific one, and then we're going to come up with a way that it gives us an ethical framework or explains away things we don't want to have. Or that's one version of Godsplaining. Or you become a religious Godsplainer and you have this retreat to this other external authority, when just the number of people that feel tasked with their own responsibility for their individual self, meaning making, identity, and don't have narrative frameworks, and yet the volume of questions that are being thrust upon you as an individual and us as a species are ones that humans haven't answered before, where the decision makers weren't also, having a shared web and narrative of meaning, value, and purpose. And I wonder how you see the need to move beyond a kind of conflict framing and someone ultimately winning this battle for the next big story. Or have you learned anything about how the wisdom and knowledge gained in science and different wisdom and religious traditions can help facilitate a conversation that decenters the kind of radical individualism that can't imagine collective response around around ethics. And then it ultimately turns into culture war battles to see who can grab the reins, and then we do what we want. And which is a rather ubiquitous feature across Western civilization currently.
Yeah, I mean, you've asked a big question. So I agree with you about deep diversity, about quite fundamental ethical pluralism. I agree with you about the loss of a shared narrative, although I would probably temper that slightly. I think we might have a bit of an idea that we had more of a shared narrative in the past than we actually did. We had more of one, certainly, but I wouldn't say that the depth of our diversity and ethical pluralism is completely unprecedented. Depends when you go back in history. I think the fundamental question, as I pick it up implicit within yours, was, as it were, who are we thinking on behalf of? And put a different way, rationality is predicated on relationality. And I did a podcast interview this morning, actually, from my own podcast, looking at limits to growth. And the person I was speaking to, who's written a really interesting book on the subject, was talking about how it's fundamentally irrational for human beings not to have taken the limits to growth challenge seriously. And I pushed back on him and said, look, I'm not defending that, but what I'm saying is it necessarily as irrational as that? If I consider myself, it's a collective action problem. If I consider myself in isolation and a temporal being, actually it's quite rational for me to use all the resources I want to, because I'm going to be around in 50 years' time to pick up the tab. And frankly, if I behave very kind of ethically and you don't, I'm being taken as a sucker. Collective action problem. So is it as irrational as that? And his response, I think, is quite right. Well, it depends how you think of yourself. If you think of yourself as an isolated individual with only very limited temporal existence and responsibility, therefore it becomes rational to pull the ladder up, Jack, and make sure I'm okay. And there is a profound danger of everybody in the world doing that. In theological terms, you might even call this sin. I'm not for any second suggesting that undiluted libertarianism is just sinful, but you can kind of see the parallel there. But here's the thing. A lot of us, most of us, all of us, we hope, have the capacity to expand that relationality and therefore expand that rationality too. And, it's that old joke about, and this plays better in the US than it does here. What do you call a liberal with a teenage daughter? A conservative. And it's a good point. When you think not about me, but about us, even if it's a relatively constricted us, you shift to a broader and, dare I say it, more generous form of rationality and form of engagement here. And I think what we repeatedly need to do is to try and attempt that. Bearing in mind, and this is the thing that drives the libertarian narrative so strongly, that over-eager attempts to push that broadened relationality, otherwise known as communism, have been moral and environmental and human catastrophes, and that a little bit of relationality might not be as good as a lot, but it's certainly better than none. So I think we need to kind of temper what we're trying to achieve here and just move people away from really restrictive, narrow, individualized ethical frameworks to slightly broader ones. They don't have to care about the entirety future of humanity. Nice if they did, probably won't. But let's care about our neighbor and our grandchildren and our fellow sort of citizens in the town first.
Well, even what you're saying there raises to me some of the places that maybe kind of unconscious elements of our culture that generate this problem to the level of intensity we have. So, right, like underneath a lot of what you're saying there is the human subjectivity is formed by neoliberalism, has this demand for growth, this the imperative on the individual to get faster at doing stuff, more efficient. As an economic system, we work to make more and more of things available to us. There's this constant acquisition. There's this ongoing speed of life where if you aren't getting more efficient, doing better, growing, and these kinds of things, you're being left behind, right? And it's easy to see how that trajectory of burnout in our own culture leads to burning up our biosphere. And when you get to the train wreck of unresolved problems socially, culturally, institutionally, when we now have a growing number of people say burning it down, right? And so the kind of economic mode, which may not have an explicit narrative, but it is the most shared narrative that we have in the West, is that we all know what it's like to reflect on how we spend our time, energy, and investment in relationship to how we show up and relate to the economic system, right? And so there's a kind of energy of alienation about the self that's there, that then you ask the question of bioengineering and whether the rich will have a completely different genetic line eventually, or any of the health extension stuff, access to health care, mental health. I mean, so many of the things you talked about in Playing God get a whole different tone just because of the unquestioned and often unexamined moral framing implicit in our economic relations that no one gets to opt out of, and you have to do better or your kids get left behind, kind of thing. And then beyond that, there's this whole other element that shows up in the way our technology is changing our relationality. That other feature that you raised in your response. So the front facing iPhone, algorithms that mediate an increasing amount of our time relating, and algorithms that are generating our most basic responses to monetize us and us becoming a product of it, right? Like that has changed the way we attend to the world, and in such radical ways that it's deteriorates to the very kind of relationship building muscles. The friction of difference and otherness is really hard if you can't even work it out with someone in your own family, because it's easier just to keep swiping, right? And so it seems to me that the big story that is increasing a lot of the questions about what it means to be human is the economic one we're sharing, and that in the way our technological relations are reorienting at the individual level, are actually generating a spiritual and meaning crisis. And oftentimes we don't treat them as such.
Yes.
They're engineering problems or things to fix. And I wonder if the way the if having a thicker account of humanity, our place in the world, what we're inheriting, a place where broadly the right and left hemispheres are together, or the humanities and sciences, or something like that, that we could learn to ask the question of the good life again, as opposed to just these individual expressions that show up that are kind of like beckoning for a larger public conversation.
I mean, I agree with that entirely. You used the phrase, was it thicker conception of the human there, I think, or something like that. I countersign that. That's the kind of phrase that people like you and me will use. I think we can kind of de-academize that and say, you build relationships. You build relationships with people you share physical space with, you share civic space with. You begin to think not just as you, but you begin to think as an us, and that is that thicker relational self, and which is going to be so important. I'll give you one actually specific example from Playing God. There's a chapter in there, we haven't talked about this yet, chapter in there on mental health and the pharmacological turn to mental health treatment in the last 35 years or so. And there are questions in there about how far that has been successful, and the answer seems to be a bit, but not as much as we think it should be, we'd like it to be. And the argument in the chapter is that, as is so often the case, we are surveying this particular landscape of the human condition, this part of the human condition, through a particular lens, a medical, pathological, pharmacological lens, and therefore what we see is to be treated medically, pharmacologically. But what, I've said this a number of times now, one of the things that really helped the penny drop for me there was reading through a report from the Office for National Statistics here, looking at the relationship between the cost of living crisis, as it was known a couple of years ago, and mental health problems. And the data show that if you have difficulty paying your gas, your electricity, if you are out of work, if you are long-term unemployed, because of sickness, if you're a full-time carer, unpaid, you're more likely to suffer from poor levels of mental health. Right at the top because the ONS has to be apolitical. It says this press release, this data release shows the correlation between mental health and cost of living crisis. It does not imply there is any causation there. Well, of course there's causation there. I mean, come on, how stupid do you think we are? They can't say that. But here's the thing, going back to your point there. If you consider us as an organism isolated from other organisms, how do you treat that mental ill health? I know how you treat it with SSRIs. You treat it as a pharmacological problem. You treat it as a malfunction of neurochemistry, and you try and deal with that. If you consider us not as isolated organisms, but deeply relationally embedded persons in the fullest sense of the word, you begin to treat some of those problems by helping them with their gas bill in the first instance, or by getting them into work. One particular lovely story I heard, a woman goes to her GP and says, I want to come off the meds. And he says to her, why are they not working? And she said to him, no, they're working absolutely fine. So he said, why on earth do you want to come off them? And she said, because I'm still married to the same abusive idiot. That's the problem. You know, the SSRIs, the drugs might work for some conditions at some times in some places, but they ain't going to get you out of an abusive relationship or help you pay your gas bill. What will is a conceptualization of the human as a person, as a relationally embedded person.
Have you found particular questions or practices or way of maybe facilitating interactions when in groups or in the public square that help that vision of a thicker account of being human come to the fore? Like what in all your kind of public engagement and stuff, I wonder if you have advice on kind of like prompting or facilitating people to kind of enter this conversation differently. You use the image of like a shallow end and the deep end of science and religion. And, if science and religion's being, like a lot like a swimming pool, so often everyone sits in the shallow end and has a nice water fight and yells when they're, they have to get out at break time or whatever at the pool. And so what kind of like wisdom have you learned on kind of facilitating the deep end with groups?
So one answer I would give to that, which, I mean, it's not with regards to groups, but when I'm sometimes asked a question like that, is, it sounds a bit macabre, go to a funeral. It's a cliche. No one says or wants at their funeral, they drove a fantastic car. You know, she was in the office so often she didn't see her kids, type thing. It struck me that, things that I said at funerals, and I've not been to many in all fairness, but things that I said at funerals, they're relational. They are, he was a great dad, granddad, uncle. He was always there for me. And they're also sort of creative as well, if I can put it that way. She was a brilliant pianist. He was a fantastic artist. They're the things we want to be reminded about. Funerals can be awful and absolutely traumatic experiences. So, I do say this with some trepidation. They're also the times when the clutter of life are cleared away and the horizon opens up, even if temporarily, and one is forced to think, what do you want to be remembered for? I mean, let's put aside the question of eternal life, resurrection, reincarnation, post-mortem existence. Let's not even go there. We don't even have to have that conversation. What do you want to be remembered for? What is metaphorically going to be chiseled on your gravestone? And it's very rarely a me thing. It's so much more often an us thing. I mean, even when it's, he was a brilliant painter, at least the unspoken implication there is he gave pleasure to the world by the exercise of the talents that he had. It's a relational thing. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting gate crashing funerals. There are all sorts of ethical problems with that, but
I don't know, but that it immediately comes, and I feel like you have a really good prompt for a little one act of a funeral where everyone actually just gets up there and does exactly what should never happen at a funeral, where like the kids are like, oh, I didn't know Dad very well, but we do have James here, he's managing his IRA. He's going to come up and talk about his investment portfolio. And then
I know.
like you only see people that where they're giving those
Yeah, it would
as
either be a
talks,
very, very good comedy sketch or an absolutely toe curling, agonizing moment.
which both of them could be pedagogical. I feel like it would be great if Monty Python did it.
Mm,
It seems like something they could get away with just the level of dryness dialed up to 11.
yeah.
Uh, so one of the one of the things that shows up when or attention that shows up when you name the anthropological crossroads of a lot of these ethics questions, things that might normally show up in the humanities and science, is like what goes on epistemologically, and science, the kind of like the archetype of scientific epistemology is one of distance, the individual's not bringing a lot there, that kind of thing, versus any kind of religious or aesthetic kind of knowing, any piece of art or a wisdom tradition, the individual subject's tangled up in it, right? Like you don't really know Christianity if you don't follow Jesus, or you don't know Buddhism if you don't practice the practices. Like you can't just listen to a lecture on the art piece and have never sat in front of it and think you really understand it. And so that different kind of epistemology going on, I think, generates something that you kind of like prize, right? Like you talk about this need, one, not for just listening, and not for just working things out easily, but even it generates friction that gets negotiated by the individual and the community. And so I wonder what role you see epistemology playing, and how being aware of it might help us have a, I don't know, generous friction of sorts, or a constructive one, when thinking about questions that show up at the intersection.
I think that's an astute point and correct. This is this is Martin Buber. This is different between you and it. This is the difference between personhood and non-personhood. This is one of the, I think, less welcome legacies of the sciences, the success of the sciences, by which I mean hard sciences on wider social life, because they have been so fantastically successful in understanding how it works, how lots of different its works. The implication is that they would be equally successful in how helping us navigate how you work. I am never going to understand how you work, Trip, if I treat you as an it, as an object to be prodded and poked. Even if I ask you questions and treat those questions as kind of data points, we would only ever, become friends and know one another in an act of self-gift. That's a fundamental kind of epistemological keystone to personalism, really, to personhood, that we get to know by the giving of the self as opposed to the withholding of the self. And just because science has proved so very successful, precisely because at some point or other it understood that I'm better capable of understanding how constituent elements work by withholding my own self from the investigation of them, it does not follow that is how we would get to know how other human beings, other persons work. Again, that's just a very elaborate and sort of pseudo-academic way of saying that it is spending time with people. It's giving them your time, your headspace, your energy, your commitment that facilitates you getting to know them.
I had a whole set of questions around consciousness, so I'm just going to give you a broad one for our last question here, and you can go wherever you want, because there there are a host of different ways, both what it means to be a human, the nature of consciousness, the philosophy of mind is something that science has problematized a lot. The kind of assumptive metaphysical account that dominated a lot of the late half of the 20th century, and now it's a live question again. And a bunch of the different topics that show up in Playing God are ones where how you understand consciousness or mind or this kind of thing changes the way we think about it. And for religious people, there's often not the assumed reductive materialist account, but an assumed kind of supernatural dualist one. And so I wonder how maybe these ethical questions are showing up that raise the question of consciousness, the scientific discoveries that are problematizing these kind of the normal typology. How does that space perhaps generate a way for people more grounded in a religious or a scientific a priori to come together and bring gifts from each other's traditions to face the challenges in the present? And maybe that's a space we learn to enact a different kind of landscape. It seems to me that there's a lot of potential, like take Christoph Kolk's work, and even like his newest book, or the Philip Goff's transition stuff towards being like heretical Christian, which is just called a mainline Protestant if you're in the United States. I was like, you can't be heretical if I'm ordained and more progressive than you. You're going to need to pick a new term. But to me, that seems to be like one of the most promising spaces where both within the guild and in the larger public square, there's potential for having a more vibrant, multi-tradition discipline and such engage in a different way, where you have moved beyond the kind of warfare framing to do it well. And as someone who both works in it, but also thinking in your work in a think tank and in public intellectual and stuff, I wonder how you see any of those things that show up there, because I mostly just had like 9 questions about it that I'm going to let you do with what you want.
I stumble with consciousness, partly because a lot of the time I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about, and a lot of the time I'm not sure most people know what they're talking about. Going back to our earlier conversation about how you define science and how you define religion, well, I think how you define consciousness puts that on steroids, really. I wouldn't be a panpsychist. I mean, I can tick off things I wouldn't be. I don't really see the convincing evidence for panpsychism. I mean, the idea that, at the other end of the extreme, that we're not conscious at all, I find a bit silly, really. I wouldn't waste too much time on that. Heretically, I have some sympathy with Dan Dennett's position on this, although I may have misunderstood it. I've heard him describe the brain as simply, consciousness as simply the brain watching itself. I'm not sure what I think about that idea, but I don't think it's as awful as I know a lot of believers, just outright dismiss it. I would adopt the position of an emergentist, whereby consciousness, whatever it is exactly we mean by consciousness, emerges at a certain level of complexity, that the potential for it is there at simpler levels, certainly, and self-evidently, or tautologically, really, but that it only emerges at a certain level of neuronal complexity. I don't see it as being a fundamental argument for the existence of God or for the existence of a minded universe, except in as far as the universe seems set up to draw mind out of matter, if you like, for matter to navigate its way to mind. But then, when we're talking about mind, are we also talking about consciousness there? Could you have a mind without it being a conscious mind? I genuinely don't know. I kind of think that our terms, like science and religion here, are being used in different ways, that we're talking past one another, that it's incredibly difficult to get a handle on the subject. That could, dovetailing back to your initial question, be a real potential. It could be that, well, actually the field is open here, right? This is uncharted territory, it's difficult territory, and so this is a place where people from different traditions, religious, non-religious, so on and so forth, can actually meet and discuss. So there's, as it were, potential in that unchartedness. But equally, it might work the other way, which is that, because we don't know what we're dealing with here, it's relatively easy just to have my interpretation of it and to weaponize my interpretation of it as yet another battle, yet another weapon in a culture war. So that's a bit of a vague and rambling answer.
Well, I did a series of interviews where I talked to multiple scientists who said they changed their theory of mind because of their scientific research projects. And my job in the whole project was actually like trying to figure out how they're using the language and what actually generated them changing their mind on a particular perspective. And so like there are people that will use the language of panpsychism who would say that historically it emerges in a form of strong emergence because they don't want mind to supernaturally appear in the cosmic story at some point. So whatever the constitutive building blocks of experiencing subject have to always already be given. Its intensity at some point of experience gets to the point you identify it as consciousness. Sometimes that's what's going on in integrated information theory when they're doing research and like, oh, it's, when phi comes on, it's when information is being integrated to the point of discernible experience and such. And so like even a lot of those terms in philosophy of mind, like what does panpsychism, experience or consciousness or mind mean? They have different use protocols in different disciplines. And then like within philosophy, like how it gets used has so much to do with, kind of like a Thomist uses it different than a Whiteheadian. And even though they're using a lot of the same words. So, but the interesting thing I found talking to scientists who say like religiously inflected scientists who reject supernatural kind of dualism because of science and seeing as more integrated in nature tended to be Catholic scientists inspired by Pope Francis' work and this kind of thing. So they get to a form of kind of emergent dual aspect monism or something like that to someone like Christoph Koch or where coming from a more kind of materialist one where it no longer works. There tended to be something that problematized a reified account of experience, mind, and such. And those individuals see that question as entailing a question not just about the human, but about nature itself, right? That this question has something to do with how we relate to our non-human neighbors or how we value life and its emergence collectively, right? It's raising some kind of larger ethical questions. And then in that space, a kind of rejection of it being a pure epiphenomenon and emerging in stuff is one of the, I attempted making typologies. Yeah, because that's what philosophers tend to do when you get uncomfortable. And one of the like scientific bits where people, if you put it down to kind of like the three groups that would have your a prioris and then not sure where you land, was something like Jonathan Delafield Butts in he's in Glasgow, University of Glasgow, and was doing these studies on twins in utero, right? And then using biosemiotics, like so that at what point do these twins demonstrate some awareness of their environment and interpret it and interact with it, right? A feature that for a lot of his coworkers who would have taken Dan Dennett's account, right, seriously, it is attached to the brain. And then what do you do when a whole bunch of twins are playing with each other prior to having a brainstem? Like before the actual material entity that later we locate consciousness in or give this reductive account, you actually see the expression taking place where twins are doing things with each other that no baby does, like when they're on their own in there, and they have these kind of interactions. And anyway, and so talking with him, and then all the scientists that are working on this paper was this place where he's sitting there looking for a metaphysical picture, right? That this phenomena could give rise to, because the a priori one that he and a lot of researchers would generally have, it doesn't fit, right? And then what comes up in the conversation around it are often the ethical implications if it's not just something that an expression or contingent just on the brain itself. And anyway, there are a bunch of examples like that, but the fascinating thing to me apart from just being a philosopher that likes to have opinion on it and try to see if it can be falsified by experiments, is going, even the researchers themselves are discovering, oh, for the actual thing I've been spending this time on, I need a thicker account of nature to make space for what I've discovered. And it's one that I know almost immediately has ethical implications about how we relate to life. And it opens up this much more mysterious account of even like consciousness or human existence and all these kind of things. And I remember one of the times I was talking with Christoph Koch where he and he has this large story of moving from a Francis Crick student, running the whole mind research stuff for at Google and this kind of thing. And towards the end of the conversation, I'm like, so when did this, when did your kind of like research project become so existentially significant to you? And he talks about a deep spiritual experience and the death of a dog, and he did that while being recorded. But there are plenty of others, right? Like after being the philosopher who's helping them think through their language use or whatever. I asked, when did this question become existentially significant? And you have to ask it, presuming it is. If you don't, they will tell you about like what they read one time that made them think of something. But when did it become existentially significant? And there's usually some significant experience, of noetic quality or something with grief. That's what, I just made balloons pop up. Something with grief, which made me think of your advice to go to a funeral.
Yeah.
Or like it didn't become existentially significant till their unexamined or kind of their metaphysical a prioris were just problematized by their own research. Anyway, sorry, that was a long rambling thing, but that's why I find that conversation so fun, because we don't have, it's not, the territories of what we're doing are not even described in a place where there's enough solidity to really dismiss positions until you get to really know how people are using the language, because it's just that complicated.
Yeah.
How do you reframe the question of do I have a soul when talking with in a religious context that the kind of affirms what they're wanting to protect while opening them up while making space to take the scientific account of the human more seriously?
Do you mean speaking to religious believers who use that word, that phrase? Well, because I don't believe in the soul in any Platonic sense, the temptation would be to try and persuade others of the view that I hold, whilst not in any sense eroding their religious faith. Doing that with the soul obviously has its certain challenges, because if you listen to the way that people talk about it and then you think, well, hang on, if you literally mean this, how do you square it with X, Y, and Z? And is that really a true kind of account of what the gospel scriptures? But I'm not unduly concerned about this, because actually I think the soul is a very effective placeholder word. I mean, I stopped reading fiction for ages. I read it a lot at university for my degree, and I continued reading it, but then life got in the way, and stuff I read was stuff I had needed to read. And I've only really, in the last few years or so, got back into reading novels, and tried to read some of the canon of English literature that I managed to avoid first time round because it was just too long. But I've got a little habit, when I'm reading these books, I always note in the back of them when the word soul is used. I've got these loads of kind of Penguin classics with just page references on it. And not surprisingly, it's used a lot. It's used an awful lot in Dostoevsky. Boy, just the soul come up a lot. But it comes up in Jane Austen too, and it comes up in Thomas Hardy, and it comes up in Charles Dickens, and so on and so forth. But virtually never does it come up in a way that would be a kind of a recognized Cartesian soul. When people talk about, this has gone to the depths of my soul, or this has hurt my soul, or my soul yearns for this, or whatever else, they're not talking about the kind of thing that may or may not interact with the pineal gland. They're talking about, and then here, fill in your favourite formulation. They're talking about what matters most to me, what is most profound, moving, deepest, what is a combination of my will, but also my kind of inchoate, gifted yearning, etc., etc., etc. we need a word to describe that, because you can't go through the slightly vague and contorted list of different words I used back then. It's unwieldy. Soul is quite good. Soul is quite good. You know, I think that in that regard, at least Descartes did us a massive disservice by trying to say, okay, everyone's talking about the soul. Come on, let's try and define it, lads. And as soon as it starts to define it, oh, hang on a second, it doesn't really make sense. Yes, but it's not used in that way. We're not talking about it in that way. This is why one of the interviews I did for the book, the Landscapes book, someone said, you occasionally, this is the kind of view you pick up in Yuval Noah Harari, although he wasn't one of the interviewees. If you were to open up the human brain and look for the will, you wouldn't find it in there. Really? Well, that's me persuaded then. That means we don't have any will. It doesn't work like that. Language is not operating, in this particular level, language is not operating in that way. And therefore, I'm actually relatively easygoing about religious people using the word soul up until the point they start talking about it as if they Descartes. And that might, I might say, well, okay, what exactly do you mean by that?
That's really helpful. It actually makes me think of another Wittgensteinian concept you mentioned earlier, language games and the kind of family resemblance. In soul, there makes me think of the duck rabbit, the whole like notion of seeing as, that all the constitutive features of this could be seen as either a duck or a rabbit in the picture, and you can't abstract what you're beholding from the kind of like existential wager of such to see it as a duck or as a rabbit. And I think that that language of seeing as is helpful, especially with someone. I mean, when you like that notion of sapiens, the like throughout it, he has such a absolutist reductive account of human beings, right? Where he's like, religious myths are all imagined fictions produced from collective imagination and not objective reality, right? Like, it's like looking at the duck rabbit and being like, that is a duck. And if it is not a duck, then you're ridiculous, and the just the example of soul you gave there and looking at it in literature is just to point out, like, if the language of soul gets kind of there's some archetype of it is created by finding the philosopher that uses it in the most odd way, make that normative so you can dismiss it. I mean, it's a lot how Hume relates to miracles, right? Like, oh, well, let's generate this concept of miracles so we can dismiss it.
Yeah, and it's pure, right, and it's pure Wittgenstein in that if you want to understand what we're talking about, look at the form of life. Okay, if you see the lover standing on the balcony crying out, "My soul yearns for you," you don't say, "Oh, really? What? I mean, is your soul immaterial? How does it interact?" You know very well what they're talking about because you understand the form of life in which that word is embedded.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. And you want to give everyone a heads up of all the different places you exist on the internet?
I actually really only exist in one place on the internet. Well, I've got a Twitter account, which I never use, and I exist on the Theos website, theosthinktank.co.uk. But I'm of the disposition and very popular generation that just feels like a net alien. So I'm there, but uncomfortably.
Well, but you show up on a number of different podcasts. You mentioned the BBC one that initiated the Magisterial one, ongoing ones, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I run a podcast at Theos called Reading Our Times, which looks at big ideas books effectively. So we run 2 series a year, and I speak to really good authors about really important books that are written about really interesting ideas. So what's not to like. So yeah, people can access and listen and subscribe to that.
Yeah, and I'll put links for that and all the books and such. And the new one on landscapes of science and religion comes out next month, I think, in America. So.
In America, that's right. Yes, in fact, I have a copy right in front of me there. I've just got the UK version, which I think is exactly the same as the US version. But yes, the UK version is here, and the US one out shortly.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Been a great pleasure. Great questions. Thank you so much.